Thank you everyone for coming this evening. Tonight we are happy to welcome George Wallace and John Slutsky from the Agricultural Advisory Board of Larimer County. This volunteer advisory board was established 20 years ago and advises the county commissioners on matters affecting agriculture. We have a number of reports that they gave to the county commissioners earlier this year on the impacts of immigrants on the ag sector here in Larimer County. If we've run out of reports, you can go to www.fccan.org and click on the Fuerza Latina tab, and we'll have copies of those up in the next 24 hours or so.
I'm John Slutsky, and I'm a dairy farmer. My wife and I have a farm just north of Fort Collins. We milk about 1,400 cows and have about 30 employees, so I think I have some perspective on ag employment. And in fact, most of our employees are immigrants, Latinos even, and so I bring that perspective in history. We've been doing this for about 35 years, so as our farm grew, we became more, we had a bigger staff, if you will, and had more serious training. You know, our first employee was part-time and knew what she was doing, but as maybe more than we did actually. But we've learned how to be, I hope, good employers and good bosses, and a little bit about that we'll seep through. Going to be a lot of dairy talk because that's what I know, but we'll try and cover some other sectors of agriculture, and we might even veer off the path of agriculture just because we're talking about immigration, and immigration goes beyond agriculture, and some of the things we're going to talk about kind of impact the community beyond agriculture, so that's what we're going to do.
I'm George Wallace. We farm north of Fort Collins, about 13 miles, and we've been out there about 47 years. And we've used immigrant labor from time to time over the years, starting way back when the Dreher Pickle Factory was still active here, and we raised cucumbers and sweet corn and needed a lot of hand labor at that time. I want to acknowledge the others on the Ag Advisory Board. John and I are both on the Ag Advisory Board, and we had some people work on this paper with us who are not here. Bill Spencer, Greg Schreiner, who's the operator manager of Silver Reef Farms, and Tim Klaus, who is works for USDA. Bill is a professor emeritus of ag economics. So we had a good group. We worked hard on this paper, and last year the Board of County Commissioners asked us to help them think through the issue of immigration, and this was well before it was in the media every day, and it became a widely discussed topic. We got to work. We dug out a lot of sources and information, which we organized into the white paper that we present to the commissioners. We did that last February, and then later the next month we presented it to Sheriff Justin Smith. After that, it's in the public record, and so we're able to present some of this information to the public, and we're glad that you've taken the time to listen to us. The 26 sources that we used for this paper came from across the political spectrum, and interestingly enough, when all is said and done, they reflect bipartisan support for immigration reform and restraint when it comes to law enforcement. We're gratified that the data that we uncovered is also now being featured in articles in Atlantic Monthly, The Economist, Time, a variety of newspapers, so we feel pretty confident about these sources. And any of the data that we give you, we're not going to cite every source, but we have those sources in the paper if you're interested. We hope that this discussion adds to the civility in our community about this often controversial issue. And and reduces the tendency to make it a polarizing one.
We're going to talk about the economic impact of immigration, specifically for agriculture, but we're also going to talk about other sectors, because other sectors share our labor pool, and as I said, we're going to go off track a little bit every once in a while. The type of visas and documents used by immigrant workers. We're going to talk about the untalkable, the undocumented workers, a pretty complex discussion, issue, and it's something that it's on everyone's mind, so we're going to give some voice to that. What local law enforcement is doing regarding immigrants, immigrant workers and their families, and how local law enforcement and culture has impacted our workers and their families. Existing legislation, a little history about how we got here from years ago and where maybe we're going to go. Other groups, there are other groups besides agricultural groups working on immigration reform and legislation, and maybe a little perspective about the world and how other countries deal with immigrants and immigration. Immigrant workers in Colorado, the economic impact. Colorado has a pretty good agricultural base, $40 billion a year in sales, 173,000 jobs in agriculture and associated businesses. A third of our workers, our farm workers, are undocumented. And a third of the workers in the state work in agriculture, give or take. Dairy, horticulture, vegetables, livestock producers and food processors, we're all sharing this pool of workers, and really with other industries as well. They bring a pretty good work ethic. They're here to work. I mean, it's not like they've come up here for tourism or to suck the life out of our social services. They're here to work, and they're able to learn the skills. Agriculture's got a little complex. The work is not, we're not digging ditches with shovels anymore. We're using tractors. We're using GPS units and tractors that are controlled by satellite, and milking equipment that's hooked up to computers. And so it's not a simple industry anymore, and our workers we're lacking workers. We're always looking for someone, and if we were to be impacted by mass deportations, that would make our bad situation worse. The loss to our state says 100 million. I wonder if that is low, and because if you think about it, if there's no dairies, there's no cheese plant, and so we're going to lose hundreds, thousands of workers just because the raw material isn't available for processing. Our undocumented workers do pay taxes. They contribute to our society, and really don't get the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of those taxes. They earn millions, billions of dollars a year and pay millions in taxes.
In Colorado, undocumented, we can use the term unauthorized interchangeably with undocumented, and you'll see why in a minute, but they made over $3 billion and paid $311 million in taxes, and they pay into entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security, and they get very few of those benefits. So one of the myths surrounding immigrant labor is that they're a drain on our society, and we're going to point out a number of ways that they actually contribute to the economy and to other people's benefits. I think it is worth mentioning that in Larimer County we have 2.3% unemployment. That's basically full employment. So if we lose workers, it's already hard enough to find people to do this type of work, and if we lose more workers, it's going to be difficult. because there just aren't that many people looking to work in this sector. On a national level, most recent studies have actually upped this figure from 16% to 18% nationwide unauthorized immigrant workers in agriculture, 12% in construction, lots of them in leisure and hospitality, hotels and restaurants, manufacturing and so forth. All you have to do is drive around town and see who's working, and you get a pretty good idea of, these are probably, this data is probably low because a lot of the studies that are done don't reach everybody that's out there working. In half the states, in all the western states except Nevada, ag is the industry with the largest share of undocumented workers. And the proposed deportations would leave us with about 4 million unfilled jobs. And Social Security Administration, for example, says that in 2013, undocumented workers paid $13 billion into Social Security system and perhaps received $1 billion in benefits.
So this is really interesting for me, is that these are figures about undocumented workers, but there are maybe equally as many documented immigrants in the United States. For example, in Colorado, there's 500,000 immigrant workers, and about 200,000 are naturalized citizens. They're voting. They're here among us, and they were perhaps undocumented at one point and found a way to citizenship. That's pretty hard right now.
We just grabbed some headlines as a sampler. Now, especially since the Trump executive order in January, we've seen day after day this issue's in the news, and a lot of other people are beginning to realize that we pay a huge economic price, and a lot of people will be, a lot of processing and indirect jobs in agriculture would go grinding down as well. So this is just a sampler of headlines. We use the term undocumented workers. That's a bit of a myth. Most of these folks have documents, but they're false. They're sold on the black market. They're readily available. And I think they almost feel a way of protecting their families and their jobs, they have to have some document like this with them in order to get the job, in order to try and not be detained and eventually deported. But you're going to see that now that we've got a new executive order, even having false documents is now been upgraded to a criminal offense. Okay, so the ones that are readily available, green cards, social security cards, and the one that everybody talks about, one of the other myths is, well, why don't you go through the process legally? The H-2A visa is the visa that people who are saying immigrant workers should go through the process legally would get. The problem with it is it's for temporary workers only. It doesn't do John any good who needs seasonal, it's for seasonal workers only. It doesn't do John any good who needs year-round folks at the dairy. Their green cards also very difficult to get. H-2A visas very difficult to get. The employers must certify in order to be eligible, and then they must request, and they pay a lot of money. The wait time is long, and the process hardly ever produces the workers in time for the work that they needed the workers for. The H-2A visas that have been issued currently only account for 3% of the agricultural labor force. So it's sort of a myth again, and I know the poster that is out there about this presentation talks about debunking myths. It's sort of a myth that it's easy. Why don't you just go through the legal process but the reason that people don't is because it's so cumbersome, so time consuming, so expensive. The system's broken. So people come as unauthorized workers. Sometimes people come because of really bad situations in their own countries having to do with drug cartels and violence and so forth. We see that fairly regularly among folks. We have talked to a number of our co-producers and colleagues that have actually reduced their acreage because they can't get enough workers. They've ceased planting certain crops and certain acres of those crops because they can't get the workers that they need. This system has not been updated in 27 years. Immigration law has not been updated in 27 years. So that's why probably the two main points that we've been pushing for with our elected officials is support for immigration reform. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail as we go. We need immigrant workers while that immigration reform progresses. And right now, because of the recent administration's upgrading of facilities and resources and all sorts of ways to detain and deport workers, there's a great deal of fear and distrust. Our workforce has been destabilized. Public safety has been destabilized because people don't come forward to report real crimes or abuses. And by the way, we're not up here to defend criminals. We just as soon get rid of them. But only if you look at the citizen population versus the immigrant unauthorized population, U.S. citizens are 5 times more likely to be felons than undocumented workers are. That's the data. So that's another myth. That we've got, we've just got all these criminals running around. We just got to get rid of all 11 million people because you never know when they're going to show up. Our county jails are actually the main conduit for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE, we'll just use the word ICE from now on, uses to identify and detain, and we're trying to get everybody to put holds on anybody that's detained so that they can then take them into detention themselves. We've looked at some communities where there aren't big raids too often, but we've had some in Greeley, we've had some in Lexington, Nebraska, and other processing plants, meat packing plants and so forth. And when that happens, I'm particularly familiar with the case in Lexington, Nebraska, because I have a friend with a ranch right there. Those workers are deported and then they're replaced with refugees. In this case from Somalia, Vietnam, and places where all of a sudden the school system in Lexington has a lot of challenges, language challenges, cultural differences that they never saw before. The traditional immigrant population is fairly assimilated. They're fairly easy for communities to deal with by comparison. So the replacement workers can be a strain on communities. You see reference here to the 287G, which is a federal program that ICE has to provide resources to local sheriffs and police departments for training, so we can work together, so you guys can be deputized so that you can help us with detention and deportation. And it's tempting because there are resources that departments need, but that's the kind of thing that we're asking. And we asked Sheriff Smith directly to please be very reluctant to cooperate with that kind of a program. Our people are good people, and they work hard, and we just think it's wrong to look for ways to work with ICE right now to identify people. Restraint.
So let's talk a little bit about families and our workers. And again, we have a lot of numbers here, but I hope they bring a pretty good work ethic. They're here to work. I mean, it's not like they've come up here for tourism or to suck the life out of our social services. They're here to work, and they're able to learn the skills. Agriculture's gotten a little complex. The work is not, we're not digging ditches with shovels anymore. We're using tractors. We're using GPS units and tractors that are controlled by satellite, and milking equipment that's hooked up to computers. And so it's not a simple industry anymore, and our workers we're lacking workers. We're always looking for someone. And if we were to be impacted by mass deportations, that would make our bad situation worse. The loss to our state says 100 million. I wonder if that is low. And because if you think about it, there's no dairies, there's no cheese plant. And so we're gonna lose hundreds, thousands of workers just because the raw material isn't available for processing. Our undocumented workers do pay taxes. They contribute to our society, and really don't get the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of those taxes. They earn millions, billions of dollars a year and pay millions in tax, something that is made up. Our workers are mostly residents of town, and a good portion of them in Fort Collins. So their contribution is to this town, and they're supporting these social services. That the drain on social and public services is one of those myths.
We did find some other studies that report declines in health and educational outcomes, increases in poverty and food dependence, insecurity, among those families that have had deportations. You might mention about the food bank. Food bank does provide, they don't ask for citizenship. And those of you that contribute to the food bank, really all they want to know is that people have a job here and a residence, and they're not just passing through. And so there are some limited services that go to these folks, and one of the things we asked the county commissioners was to, where possible, allow those limited services to continue.
So how did we get to this point? Maybe this isn't quite how we got there, but our history does guide us in maybe how we can avoid things in the future. And this slide starts with the Fuerza program, but really prior to that, the U.S. has pretty bad record when it comes to ag workers. Agriculture hasn't treated their workers quite as well as, even as well as we are now, but we really need to recognize that our first ag workers came a few years after Jamestown was settled, 1600s, and those vulnerable people were indentured servants. And when that program ended, if you will, when those indentured servants settled their contracts, and there were slaves, and so that's our history. That's where we started with agricultural immigration, and it's because it's a similar now. Those folks, they came over, and it was like, wow, we got all this land. Look what we can do, and there's nobody to do it. So that's how it was figured out, and we're not at that point now. But the Fuerza program was kind of like that. It was 1942, but really got going right after the war, when labor was at a minimum in the United States, and there were still farms and other jobs. The railroad needed workers. So the Fuerza program was put in place to bring immigrant workers to the United States and work for pretty low wages. And that's what it was. There's about 4.5 million Mexican agricultural workers that came to the United States in that period. And they were not really treated quite as well as they could have been. Very low wages. Some of those wages were withheld with the promise of repayment when they went home, but that really didn't happen. There is still about $5 million in payments due to Mexican workers from this period of 1942 to 1961, which I don't see it being paid, but the money's there, I think. The program was put in place to stop illegal immigration. That was the idea. And after a while, it didn't work because of these horrible conditions. Some states didn't actually sign on to the Bracero program, and it gave birth under President Eisenhower to this awful program called Operation Wetback, which didn't really last very long, one part of 1 year, but it is interesting and horrible, of course, that our current president is making reference to it and touting how this program quickly removed millions of undocumented workers and sent them back to Mexico. The truth is there was not millions, there was a couple 100,000, maybe 250,000, and of those that were rounded up, and that's what this was rounding up people pretty much based on skin color, I think, and sending them back to Mexico. Some of them were actually US citizens, some of them were documented, but they all ended up, those handful of people ended up being abused. Some of them died, and I think we really need to learn not to do that again and fight our president on that particular note, if maybe others. Other legislation, one that's not up there real quickly, is the Immigration Nationality Act of '52. That's where our H-2 program was first born, and it was in the, where is it, right? The Immigration Reform Control Act of '86 took that program and refined it and split it into Part A and Part B. This Immigration Reform and Control Act is the last comprehensive immigration law that we have. This is where we are today. This was Ronald Reagan's baby, if you will. This is the one where amnesty was born, where workers that had been in the United States for prior to 1982 were given amnesty and a path to citizenship. And it's where the I-9 form was born, and it's where sanctions and penalties for employers that knowingly hire immigrants without documentation. This is all a part of this Immigration Reform and Control Act. So that's really where it ends. There's many other smaller pieces of legislation, executive orders that talk about immigration, but they all are born from this particular law. Obama in 2012 tried to supplement that with the DACA, our Dreamer Act, and then again in 2015 he tried to add to that with their parents. The DACA Act is in effect. It is going to court, and there's some more than just a slight chance that it'll end up in the Supreme Court, and I'm not sure how well that'll turn out. The DAPA, the Deferred Action for Parents, was blocked in the courts. So that's really where we end as far as what's on the books now, except of course for President Trump's executive order, and we'll discuss that in a second. The one thing that we almost had was in 2013 when the Gang of Eight, which was 8 senators, had a very comprehensive immigration reform package that would have given protection to ag workers and a path to citizenship, and others as well. And it failed, not really in the House. It passed in the Senate, and the House did not take it up. So it failed by lack of vote. And just to mention our good Senator Bennett, again, he currently has a bill pending, and it's in the Judiciary Committee, I believe, and it may just stay there forever. But it takes a piece out of this Border Security and Economic Opportunity Modernization Act for a new blue card for ag workers and a path to citizenship again.
To be fair to the legislation 83 and 86, there were a number of improvements made regarding housing, field conditions, safety, and you know, there was a lot of activity on the part of farm workers, such as many others, that helped stimulate that. But there were some positive changes. Now we're in the era of the administration's executive order, January 25th. That order calls for 5,000 new ICE officials and 10,000 new Border Patrol positions. It also calls for an increase in the number of detention facilities. We'll talk about that in a minute, but basically jails. Continuous detention has replaced what used to be a policy of catch and release, where you detain an undocumented, unauthorized worker, but then they would come back for hearings, and it would be they were free in the meantime. Now they're not being allowed to leave detention. The mentioned before, the broadening of the definition of criminal activity now includes, pretty much makes all undocumented, unauthorized workers felons, because most everybody, as we said, have documents that were purchased on the black market, and that's now considered to be a felony. Again, a lot more pressure on local police and sheriff departments to collaborate with ICE, become sort of deputized and trained, and infusion of resources to spend their time helping ICE find folks. Also mentions publicizing crimes committed by unauthorized residents, and it removes federal privacy protection. So if you go, oh, by the way, I forgot, on documents. We have a policy in Colorado that's a wise policy, and that is, even if you are unauthorized, you can get a driver's license. There's a couple of offices where you have to take the test, and you have to have insurance, which is good for everybody. And it's difficult, and there's a long wait, but now even the information that people turn in at that point is no longer private. The DACA kids, their information is no longer private. And so we've got people fearful for that reason. Now, all of a sudden, the information about them is, the federal government is saying, you can't keep that from us anymore. So you've all read about stepped up deportations and detention deportations. One thing you probably haven't read about is private detention centers. The administration has turned to contracts with private contractors that are operated like jails, and they have guaranteed minimum payments for X number of beds. So now the federal government has paid for so many beds, and there's probably a certain amount of pressure to fill those beds, and that's shown up in a couple of places. Hard Country News actually had a pretty good article on these detention centers in the western states. You've also heard about threats to sanctuary jurisdictions to withhold federal funding. Fort Collins is not, but there are 300 some sanctuary jurisdictions, including some big cities, that are resisting and still providing and withholding information and not cooperating fully with ICE and so forth. To make matters worse, we've got some states where legislators have introduced legislation saying that if you don't cooperate with ICE, it's against the law. You have to cooperate. Texas, I think, is the only, isn't that right, the only state so far that's actually passed legislation related to this. So there's a lot of people that are worried about the effect on the economy and the human rights and the costs of deportation and so forth. Lots of groups working on to ask for restraint and for immigration reform. All the major agricultural organizations have come out in support of immigrant labor and the need for reform and a path to citizenship. Nobody's defending criminals. None of us do that, but we do know, and the people we know are not, They're hardworking, they're friends, they're people we learn from, as well as people doing very much needed work. Colorado's for immigration reform include groups like the Colorado Business Roundtable, Chambers of Commerce, the farm organizations, the Dairy Farmers of Colorado, Colorado Competitive Council, Associated Builders and Contractors, Hotel and Restaurant Association, and so forth. So there's really a lot more support out there than you might imagine. Partners for New American Economy is a national group with 500 both Republican and Democrat and independent mayors and business leaders. We have some local groups like Fuerza Latina who invited us here this evening, who are doing things to help educate immigrant working families about what they might prepare for, how to deal with possible retention and deportation. We've got, and a number of good publications. I've seen a couple on the table here that maybe Cheryl would like to talk about later. At CSU, El Centro considers immigrant students to be assets. They advocate they are withholding information about them and fairly assertively defending them. Our Ag Advisory Board, we came to consensus around this paper, around this topic. That's the reason we're here tonight. And as John mentioned, we've got a senator who is working very hard for immigration reform. So please keep an eye on that legislation and support it when you can.
This is a presentation for our commissioners, and this was our ask of them. And basically, we would like, when you go down to the last bullet, to really, that's our big ask, is for local law enforcement to take care of public safety and human rights and not be so concerned with the people that are working in our industries, not just agriculture, of course, but that's what we were talking about. We need a guest worker program, a stable agricultural workforce. Clearly our system is not working and needs reform. Our commissioner's not going to do that, but they don't have to be a part of the process that is going on today. There's such a large human cost associated with the deportation and an economic part. Studies that we looked at showed about a $10,000 cost per deportation, and it's going to take 20 years to get the 11 or 12 million immigrants deported, and that's a lot of zeros. And it's really a cost that brings a loss. So we're going to have a loss to our GDP of over $5 trillion because of these deportations in 10 years, and not counting the cost of the deportations. There's going to be lost revenue to the government, of course, because of lost productivity and taxes. It's going to be $90 billion in 10 years. It's a big expense to do it, and then it's a big loss when it's implemented. And I don't see that as possible. But just to consider it seems I think the word's asinine. So, county services are available to undocumented residents, but not very many, and those should be maintained, like George mentioned, the food bank. Those just help stabilize our families, and they need to continue. This is an excerpt from the Colorado Compact, which was something that our Senator Bennett, this sounds like a Senator Bennett kind of fan club, but we don't have too many people that we can talk to about this, and somebody that actually is on our side. I'm not going to read this, it'll be up there for a little bit. You can actually find the Colorado Compact online if you're interested. I think it's in our white paper.
It's in the appendix.
And it was a compact that Senator Bennett had 80 or maybe more industry groups sign on to, and with the idea that this would help him and the Gang of Eight with their legislation in 2012. It says 13. So this is something that I think we would be well advised to take up again. A number of us are close to our workers, and just showing some empathy and concern for their human rights. It seems so simple to me. This is what farm workers look like, at least on my farm. We do, dairy farming is not just milking cows, but I think that's what pays the bills. So we do that on a regular basis. We treat our animals, we take care of equipment, and of course we have a lot of paperwork.
We have very sophisticated equipment in other parts of agriculture as well, GPS systems on tractors, precision equipment that allows us to be a lot more efficient. I'm actually learning how to use that system from an immigrant who mastered it a couple of years ago.
So because we, not just because, of course, but because we need to retain our employees, and we have this threat of losing more employees, and not really just because of the deportation. As George mentioned, we have 2.3% unemployment in our county, and not much more than that in our state. So the pool of workers that we have is fairly limited, and there's not enough of them now. We share a pool of workers with hospitality services, with construction, landscaping. We're all trying to get employees and find ways to keep them. And turning over employees is the last thing we want to do. So we have to do these things. I don't need to read them all. I think the bottom line is the bottom line: treat with respect. People do come to work for a salary, but I think that part is as important. We need to be able to have long-term employees, and you can't do that unless you have a partnership with them. We have employees on our farm that have worked with us for a couple of days, and we have some that have worked with us for almost 30 years. And so our goal is to treat those new employees as well as we can, so that they're, well, I can't say they're going to be with us for 30 years, but I'm only 20, you know? But that's what I think we need to do, and we need our government to help us do that. We need our government to help us retain our workers and not threaten them and cause them to leave our workplace and our county.
The grim reality, however, of being able to provide those things is that the cost of food is going to have to go up. It has to be incorporated in the cost of food. And the way the system works right now, it's really difficult to get it in there, because there will always be people who not necessarily are providing these things who will produce food for less.
This first bullet is a few years old, but it struck me when I saw it, and it's something that I've heard other farmers say, is that our local workers do not have a good work ethic, that they don't want to do this kind of work. And I can, if you remember back a few years, you hear about on the western slope where fruit was rotting on the vines. More close to home, I can remember a field of vegetables just down the road from my house with a sign out front saying, "Free to anyone who can pick it," because they just didn't have anyone to pick their crops, and they had to pick the crops that they were going to harvest, and that just wasn't one of them. This second bullet is pretty interesting to me as a dairy farmer, because this town, and I can't remember the name, in Italy, it's a dairy sector where they make Parmesan cheese, pretty important in Italy, and they had the same problem where the children of their farm workers were not interested in working on farms. They were like the children of our farm workers. We have workers with children, they're not coming back to our farm. We need to have a guest worker program where we can continually replace the workers that retire, hopefully, or leave. But in this Italian town, they actually found workers in India that wanted to immigrate and work on dairies. And that's a picture of one gentleman right there. He's from Punjab, and they welcomed these people and welcomed their culture, let them build mosques and have the days that they need for service, and it's a really great story, and you can look all this stuff up on the web. I didn't just make it up. Spain and New Zealand and Australia, they rely on immigrants to do their agricultural jobs.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
And one of the parts of immigration reform that has to happen is creation of visas for what the producers lobby calls essential workers. We don't have visas they can work legally on that work. If we did, there wouldn't be so many undocumented workers. So that's why we all have to advocate for comprehensive immigration reform. They can't become permanent residents or citizens based on these jobs. So why should they do it?
Are you as an employer at risk legally for hiring people who don't have papers, documents?
We don't do that. They have documents that we look at and we say, okay, they look good, and they do. And have we ever fired someone because they didn't have papers? Yeah, I have. If I know someone is undocumented, I am at risk. But generally, people come, they provide a social security number, they give you some kind of ID, mostly a permanent resident card, a green card, and if you fill out the I-9 form, you are protected. You've done your job. I'm not an immigration officer. I am not trained to look at documents. I can look at one and say, oh gee, yeah, your number is A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, that's not right. But mostly they're more sophisticated than that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
I mean, we have teachers and all kinds of people who can't get a job that makes enough money where they live, or where they're almost really refugees from being in Central America. But they come here to work, and they come here and they're resilient, they're really bright, and they have a lot of qualities that are fabulous. And if they knew how to do all those computers and spoke English, somebody else would snap them up right away. You know, so a lot of times they don't stay with us forever. They wait until they learn English, and then they're off on jobs that pay a little better, and maybe a lot better later. So those are some things I really want people to understand. The people that work for us are incredibly good employees most of the time, and that's important. So.